Hello everyone, welcome to the Tim Booker channel. Wishing you a delightful listening experience. This audio session interprets the book My Promised Land, subtitled The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. It delves into Israel's monumental history, from its inception to the establishment of the nation, illustrating how the Jewish people wedged a country into the heart of Middle Eastern geopolitics. It elaborates on the tragic predicament in which modern Israel finds itself, seemingly destined for ongoing challenges. Israel has been a hot topic in recent Middle Eastern history. Among all the countries in the region, Israel's story resonates most profoundly. Before its formation, Jews endured centuries of immense dispersion and suffering. Post its establishment, Israel faced 5 Middle Eastern wars, surrounded by relentless conflict. However, in such adverse geopolitical circumstances, Israel achieved miracles. Its Iron Dome defense system, the intelligence agency Mossad, and the innovative city of Tel Aviv stand out globally. Even we, as Chinese, have benefited from Israel's success. For instance, Israel's invention of agricultural drip irrigation technology aided in cultivating crops in some barren lands in western China. All these instances seem to point to one fact: Israel is incredibly powerful. However, this book presents some thought-provoking questions. If Israel's success is built on oppressing another nation, does its success have legitimacy? Additionally, while Israel could triumph against the 7-nation coalition in its early statehood, by 2006, despite being a dominant force in the Middle East, it struggled against the 8,000-strong militia of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Is Israel becoming stronger or weaker? Some refer to this book as a comprehensive history of Israel. However, upon closer inspection, it reveals itself as a colonial history of the Jewish revival movement. The term Jewish revival movement refers to the dispersed Jewish people worldwide attempting to return to their ancient homeland, Palestine, to rebuild their nation. Colonialism aptly describes this historical phase. Simply put, the success of the Jewish revival movement was due to colonization, leading to the establishment of Israel. Yet, contemporary Israel faces profound scrutiny due to its continued colonization efforts. Many Israeli scholars avoid discussing the colonial nature of the Jewish revival movement, making this book even more valuable. The author of this book is Ari Shavit, a representative figure of the New Historians movement in Israel. This movement boldly challenges Israel's mainstream ideology and reconsiders the colonial nature of the Jewish revival movement. This book stands as a pinnacle of this movement. Its English edition was first published in 2013, coinciding with Israel's 65th Independence Day, a time of widespread celebration. However, this book feels like a splash of cold water amid the jubilation, leaving one chilled to the bone. As I read this book today, it feels like sitting with an elderly person while they painfully remove a 65-year-old thorn embedded in their body. Is it painful? Heart-wrenchingly so. Let's stop here for now. Next, I'll focus on colonialism as the core, dividing it into 3 parts to interpret this glory and tragedy of Israel. Part 1: How did the Jewish revival movement veer onto the path of colonization? Part 2: Why couldn't Israel shed its colonial nature after its establishment? Part 3: The dual doubts surrounding Jewish revivalism. Alright, let's dive into the first part. First off, how did the Jewish revival movement veer onto the path of colonization? You might find the term Jewish revival movement a bit unfamiliar. I can put it differently. If we view the Jewish return to Palestine as a grand-scale investment project, it can be broken down into 3 phases. Firstly, drafting a viable project proposal, secondly, finding suitable investors, and finally, executing the plan. The initial drafter of this project proposal was a Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl, later recognized as the father of the Jewish revival movement. In the latter half of the 19th century, Europe, especially France, Germany, and Russia, witnessed waves of anti-Semitic sentiments, leading to the expulsion of tens of thousands of Jews like rats in the streets. In the midst of this, in 1896, Theodor Herzl penned a pamphlet titled The Jewish State. Some call this book a bolt from the blue, painting a picture of a Jewish homeland for the wandering Jews. However, Herzl's proposal lacked detailed plans, offering only the objective and outline. In August 1897, he organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, refining this proposal. In this Congress, despite the absence of actual territory, they selected a national anthem for the envisioned Jewish state, established the Jewish National Fund, and formed various committees and institutions to oversee the execution of these plans. At this stage, the proposal was mostly shaped. The renowned British Jewish family, the Rothschilds, can be seen as the angel investors of the Jewish revival movement. Baron Edmund de Rothschild extensively funded the Jewish National Fund, aiding early Jewish immigrants arriving in Palestine to purchase essentials, homes, equipment, and livestock. If converted to today's currency, the amount he donated would approximate $150 million. So, armed with the proposal and angel investments, the pivotal question for the success of the Jewish revival movement lay in whether the Jewish immigrants executing the plan could establish a foothold in Palestine. However, the colonial nature of the Jewish revival movement was precisely triggered and escalated during this process. Why? This brings us to the moral dilemma early Jewish immigrants encountered in Palestine. What was this moral dilemma? Simply put, the Jews, having been expelled from Europe, detested those who expelled them. Yet upon arriving in Palestine, they realized it wasn't an uninhabited land, Arabs were already there. What to do? If the Jews didn't expel the Arabs, their dream of statehood seemed distant. But if they did, wouldn't the Jews become new colonizers? How to overcome this bottleneck? Early Jewish immigrants attempted 3 methods. The first 2 failed. The first attempt could be termed utopian. Some Jewish immigrants formed small communal societies in Palestine, fostering close-knit relationships with freedom and equality. However, many couldn't withstand the harsh living conditions, loneliness, despair, and depression, with some even committing suicide. Most eventually left for the United States. The second attempt was a bourgeois elite model. Simply put, it involved buying land and establishing colonies. Some wealthy European Jews made such investments, with Baron Rothschild, mentioned earlier, being a representative. The author's great-grandfather, before preparing materials for the Zionist Congress, specifically surveyed these colonies in Palestine. They described these colonies as overflowing with middle-class lifestyle and imbued with liberal values. However, this path was soon blocked. As the Ottoman Empire, managing Palestine at the time, suspected the Jews' ulterior motives, they swiftly altered land sale policies. They decreed that while land could be bought and sold, it couldn't be sold to Jews. Hence, the Jewish plan to buy land with money also failed. The Jews eventually established roots in Palestine through a third method, essentially a semi-military, semi-agricultural settlement system. Leading this effort were a group of young Jewish pioneers. In the summer of 1920, a group of fewer than 100 Jewish laborers formed the Jewish Labor Brigade. A year later, they settled in a valley in Palestine named the Hula Valley. After the failures of the utopian and land-purchasing models, these young individuals saw themselves as the sole hope for saving the Jewish nation. The vanguard of the Jewish nations returned to Palestine. Arriving in the Hula Valley, they pitched tents near the valley's springs. They lit torches, dug trenches, organized like an army with camps and field kitchens. They worked during the day, gathered for dinner at the campsite in the evening, prayed together, and danced. The author mentions that in Palestine at that time, everything was free, nothing could hinder these most ambitious and fearless young people. However, the colonial nature of the Jewish revival movement gradually intensified as these young Jewish pioneers resisted nature, including their resistance against the surrounding Arabs. Early Jewish revivalism couldn't accept violent expulsion. For instance, Theodor Herzl, the father of the Jewish revival movement, when deciding to purchase land in Palestine and settle Jewish refugees, had his proposal vetted by an investment advisor. The advisor praised the spectacular beauty of the Hula Valley in Palestine but highlighted that evacuating Arabs from that land would require violence. Herzl didn't agree to this approach. However, by 1920, with World War I having just ended and the first wave of global nationalist movements ongoing, Zionist Jews began to harden their hearts. They explicitly stated that during the expulsion of Arabs, actions had to be decisive and swift. Conflict between Jews and Arabs started escalating. This book notes that it was the Jewish community that initially faced attacks from Arabs. Yet, who struck first isn't crucial. What matters is that in the subsequent time, the young Jewish laborers gradually occupied and expelled Arabs by using occupation and expulsion methods, squeezing the Arabs' living space. Arab villages began getting replaced by Jewish settlements. Subsequently, Arabs suddenly realized that Jews had taken over most of their territory. Consequently, Arabs set fire to Jewish farmlands. Later on, the first Jewish elite commando unit was established. This unit launched nocturnal raids on Arab villages, killing Arab civilians. Eventually, Jews possessed a genuine army that expelled even more Arabs. At this point, we can practically answer the question posed at the beginning of this audio session: how did Israel rise from nothingness and implant itself like a wedge into the heart of Middle Eastern geopolitics, and how did Jews manage to occupy the land? In simple terms, it's two words: occupation and expulsion. So, how should we perceive the Jewish revival movement today? The author of this book argues that the Jewish revival movement was ultimately a desperate crusade of the abandoned Jewish orphans, launched by those discarded by Europe. Europe served as the surrogate mother of the Jewish revival movement. When these Jewish offspring were abandoned by their European mother, they found themselves alone in the world, without gods, without parents, without a homeland. They discarded an old civilization and had to build a new one. They were abandoned by their old home and had to create a new one. This is why Jews came to Palestine, clinging desperately and firmly to this land. Alright, that sums up the first part. How did the Jewish revival movement veer onto the path of colonization? However, you might wonder if the use of military means by the Jews to establish their own country can be somewhat understandable. Once the objective was achieved, things should have improved, right? But is that really the case? On the contrary, after Israel's founding in 1948, this sort of colonial behavior not only didn't cease but escalated. This leads us to the second part of this audio: why couldn't Israel shake off its colonial nature after its establishment? What consequences did this colonial nature bring to present-day Israel and the geopolitics of the Middle East? To understand these questions, we need to revisit two specific scenarios: the Lydda Massacre and Jewish settlements. Let's start with Lydda. The Lydda Massacre occurred a little over a month after the founding of Israel. It could be said that Israel declared independence on one day and was at war the next. Israel was officially founded on May 14, 1948. However, this day of Israel's establishment marked the beginning of chaos in the Middle East because their old adversaries, the Arabs, didn't agree. The Arab League's armies squeezed Israel from the north and south, and the nascent state was on the verge of collapse. There was a saying that due to the invasion, Israel's independence ceremony lasted only half an hour. Some even suggested depositing the original manuscript of Israel's Declaration of Independence, signed by everyone, in the Palestine Bank in the UK, to prevent this new country from dying in infancy without any historical records for future generations. The subsequent war where Arab League armies attacked Israel was the first Arab-Israeli war. However, that's not the focus of today. The focus is on a massacre during the war. This massacre occurred in the central Palestinian railway hub city of Lydda. At the onset of Israel's founding, Lydda was still under Arab control. The First Arab-Israeli War erupted in May 1948. According to the UN ceasefire agreement, a 28-day truce between the warring parties began on June 11. It was during this ceasefire that the newly formed Israel launched an operation to conquer Lydda in the name of the nation. This book mentions that it was Israel's first prime minister, Ben-Gurion, who proposed the conquest plan. On July 11, Israeli forces carried out a blitzkrieg into the center of Lydda, killing over 100 Arab civilians, including women, elderly, and children. The next day at noon, Israeli soldiers in the vicinity of the small mosque in Lydda killed over 200 more civilians, and the massacre lasted for 30 minutes. That's the Lydda Massacre. After the massacre, the frontline commander asked Ben-Gurion how to deal with the remaining Arabs in the city. The prime minister simply waved his hand and said 4 words: expel them. So, Arabs in Lydda began leaving, families displaced from their homes. The commander of the expulsion was Yitzhak Rabin. If you've been following the news, you might be familiar with this name. Rabin later became Israel's prime minister, a key figure in the Middle East peace process, and was assassinated in 1995. Thus, the Jewish people, who had just escaped the Nazi massacre, committed a massacre against Arabs in the city of Lydda in Palestine after Israel's establishment, turning victims into perpetrators. However, before Israel's establishment, Jewish actions in Palestine were about occupation and expulsion. After its founding, the newly born Israel added the plot of massacring civilians to this expulsion action. Following the massacre's expulsion, tens of thousands of Arabs were lined up and driven out of their homes. The book states that at checkpoints in the outskirts of Lydda, Israeli soldiers, under the pretext of safety searches, forced Arabs to hand over cash, watches, and jewelry. They also assaulted Arab women in exile. Amidst the chaos, children cried, women screamed, and men wept, a scene of confusion and misery. Some pregnant women who happened to be in labor were forced to leave. Israeli scholars later had serious disagreements about this history. Some defended the government, claiming that such situations were unavoidable during war, while others were vehemently critical. The author's stance is resolute. He says, "The truth is, Zionist Israel cannot tolerate Lydda." He even goes on to say that the actions in Lydda turned the Jewish revival movement into a modern-day monster. So, how did this modern-day monster change present-day Israel and the current situation in the Middle East? That leads us to the second part, the second topic I want to discuss with you, a topic that has been debated endlessly to this day, the settlements. What are these settlements? The settlements referred to now are primarily illegal Israeli settlements established on occupied Palestinian territories. These settlements often experience explosions and attacks. But have you ever wondered, since these places are so unsafe, why do Israelis continue to occupy them? Almost all member states of the United Nations condemn this occupation of another country's territory, but why does Israel persist? To understand this issue, we need to look at how settlements came to be. The Israeli settlement movement emerged due to two Middle East wars. One was the Six-Day War, in 1967, the Third Arab-Israeli War. Lasting for 6 days, Israel emerged overwhelmingly victorious, occupying significant Arab territories. At that time, Israel was less than 20 years old, and the war tested the new country's comprehensive strength. With a big win in the war, the whole country was excited and proud. However, merely 6 years later, in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, Israel was caught off guard by a relentless attack from the Arab coalition. Although the Israeli army eventually regained control, the nation had faced near catastrophe during the war. This huge sense of defeat triggered strong dissatisfaction among Israelis towards their government, particularly the Labour Party. Some radical groups took the opportunity to pressure the government to establish Jewish settlements in the occupied territories. Today, it might be perplexing why, having already achieved the dream of statehood, the Jewish people would continue to occupy others' land. Moreover, in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, colonialism was already relegated to history's dustbin. How then did something so contrary to the historical tide arise in Israel at that time, openly and supported by significant public opinion? This speaks volumes about the hidden rules of modern Jewish Zionism behind these settlements. Early Jewish pioneers arrived in Palestine, facing countless hardships, to establish settlements in valleys and wastelands, believing that a spark could ignite a blaze. The ultimate result proved their success. However, after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israelis experienced profound disappointment. At that time, the young generation sought to revive the spirit of their forebears in the face of national peril. To them, it seemed a reasonable decision. But viewed from another angle, this decision constituted a grave mistake. Simply put, it exposed two covert schemes of early Jewish Zionism. First, the early Zionist aspiration was for a predominantly Jewish state and was cautiously distanced from colonialism. To maintain this narrative, they clothed their occupation and expulsion as a Jewish national liberation movement, rigorously restraining their actions. Although they caused the tragedy in Lydda, they tried to conceal that history. They strived to govern and build a powerful Jewish state to cover up their early colonialism, proving to the world, look, we Jews rule here better than you Arabs, right? Yet, the settlement movement starting in the 1960s and 1970s overturned all this and brought new consequences. Firstly, settlements constitute an occupation. While seemingly following in their forebears' footsteps, this action not only fails to resolve Israel's conflicts with surrounding Arab countries but also revives old debts of Jewish colonialism, nullifying efforts for Israel's decolonization. Secondly, the early Jewish pioneers' occupation and expulsion led to a predominantly Jewish state. But can they still expel Arabs around the settlements today? If not, are those Jews deep within the settlements safer or in greater danger? The early Jewish pioneers paid a tremendous moral and war cost to expel Arabs. Can Israel's younger generation bear these consequences? Confidence in this is lacking. Thirdly, the early Jewish pioneers delineated Israel's national borders, but the settlement movement shattered these fixed boundaries. To what extent will Jews continue to expand? Surrounding Arab countries are uncertain. This huge uncertainty about the future blurs the geopolitical boundaries in the Middle East. Faced with an uncertain future, everyone must be on guard and prepared for constant conflict. However, within Israeli politicians, some understand. This book mentions Golda Meir, then Prime Minister of Israel, initially staunchly refusing the radical youth's call for new occupation movements. Yet, Meir succumbed to internal dissatisfaction post the Yom Kippur War. There was a dramatic detail at that time. Radical groups aimed to build new settlements in the occupied areas, and this information reached the Israeli Defense Ministry. Defense Minister Shimon Peres was ambivalent, directing the government troops late at night not to actively assist the settlers but also not to expel them. This meant the Israeli government turned a blind eye to the settlement movement. Thus, the die was cast, and the settlement movement, like a juggernaut, carried by significant public sentiment, dragged Middle Eastern geopolitics into an uncertain abyss. This is why the author Shavit asserts that settlements have become a noose around Israel's neck, their illegality spreading like cancer from one organ to another until it jeopardizes the entire body. Here, you've pretty much grasped the Jewish Zionist movement. You might have noticed that the Jewish return to Palestine has a strong narrative backdrop. The ancestors established a nation in Jerusalem, and the Jewish people, guided by God, returned to their promised land after the diaspora. It can be said that the Jewish return to Palestine is rooted in this narrative. But what if I remove this backdrop? What would happen? In other words, if this story is entirely fictional or if God never intended for the Jews to actively return to Palestine, wouldn't the Zionist movement lose its foundation, becoming questionable? Although it's quite a dramatic twist, it's not mere speculation. Jewish Zionism has always faced these two doubts. Firstly, does the Jewish Zionist movement have historical justification? The Jewish stories about their ancestors mainly come from the Hebrew Bible. However, a real issue is that modern archaeology largely questions the historical accuracy of the Exodus story. It's considered a reconstructed myth of the Israelite nation. While I can't validate this through archaeological means, this doubt, coupled with other forces, renders the Jewish return story more questionable. And what is this other force? It's the force of reality. Before the Jewish Zionist movement, Arabs were genuinely present in Palestine for thousands of years. Arabs believe that Jews constructed a mythical story of a Jewish nation, using it to displace Arabs from their homes. This is why Arabs refused to comply with the 1947 UN partition plan for Palestine. Another doubt about Jewish Zionism comes from a vital Jewish classic called the Babylonian Talmud. This work mentions 3 oaths taken by Israel and other nations. Firstly, other nations swore not to excessively oppress the Israelites. Secondly, the Israelites swore not to use force to enter Israel, i.e., present-day Palestine. Thirdly, the Israelites also pledged not to resist other nations. For centuries, devout Jews believed that without divine guidance, they should not actively return to their ancestral land, based on this scripture. Most understand that returning to that land would inevitably involve the use of force, contradicting their oath. But that's not the crux of the issue. Religious Jewish figures oppose the Jewish Zionist movement for deeper reasons. After millennia of diaspora, Jews believe in only 2 states, diaspora and redemption. Many Jewish individuals believe that continuing in diaspora until God's redemption is their religious duty. Jewish Zionism, attempting to control history in the Jewish fate, contradicts the essence of Judaism. That concludes My Promised Land. To sum up my narrative, firstly, it's a work reflecting on the colonial nature of Jewish Zionism. The author, with great courage, challenges Israel's mainstream ideology, questioning the legitimacy of the Jewish Zionist movement. Secondly, Israel's story contains two enormous controversial topics, the Lydda Massacre and the settlement movement. Building settlements in the occupied territories of Arab countries, seemingly an extension of the Jewish Zionist movement, actually exposes Israel's colonialism, dragging Israeli and Middle Eastern geopolitics into significant uncertainty. Lastly, Jewish Zionism faces two doubts: Arabs doubt Jews constructed biblical stories to displace them, and religious Jewish figures doubt Zionist deviations from oaths, using force to return to the Promised Land, attempting to control the Jewish fate, which contradicts Judaism's essence. Congratulations on completing another book. Thank you all for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with friends. Let's combine wisdom and practice to achieve financial goals and create a better future together. Thank you, goodbye.